والسلام على رسول الله يا ربنا اغفر لنا ذنوبنا لقد ظلمنا أنفسنا ولا غافر لي ذنوب إلا أنت أما بعد. We continue inshallah with our study of reliance of the devout and the skilled person by Sheikh Uthman and Fodio. We left off and we were still talking about Ilahiyat. One of the delays for this video is that I didn't want to continue without firstly pointing to an important point for the student of knowledge. The idea of looking at Aqidah from the angle of the scholars of Ilm al-Kalam, we have to realize that it was a necessity of the time, according to some of the scholars, to develop a system that talks about Aqidah issues and does so in a manner which is systematically laying out points of Aqidah within the context of certain areas of research. There's no doubt that the areas of research in Aqidah, these areas of research that we find in the science of Ilm al-Kalam overall, these points were developed within the context of Aristotelian philosophy. Whoever studied Aristotelian philosophy, which is the sister of Platonic philosophy, will get an intellectual mapping of what it is the scholars of Islam were doing intellectually. These concepts were brought into the study of Aqidah from a rational philosophical angle by the Mu'tazila. And Ash'ari Aqidah, it represents Imam Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari, who was a contemporary of Imam al-Tahawi. Imam al-Tahawi was a scholar of hadith. He had a Shafi'i background, became Hanafi, and excelled. He's one of the great scholars of the Hanafi madhab. And he is a great scholar in hadith and a great scholar in Aqidah and a number of other sciences. But Imam Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari, he found himself in opposition to the Mu'tazila and in between the philosophical approach to Aqidah and the people of hadith, which not everyone that was associated to the study of hadith was at the same level. You had some deviation among those who even subscribed to the approach of the scholars of hadith. You have some that went to an excess. But overall, you find that there's a lot of integrity, a lot of uniformity, a lot of consistency in the Aqidah books that were formulated by the scholars of hadith. And there's a whole history to that I was trying to evade, but I find that it's necessary to talk about. I was trying to evade talking about it. Because when we look at the concept of ilahiyat as an idea of studying who is Allah, it doesn't make sense without understanding the backdrop in the history. When we talk about how to answer the question, who is Allah, in the traditional kalam approach, which became dominant, and it decreased or minimized the approach of the scholars of hadith. In today's time, we hear more about the approach of the scholars of hadith because there's been movements to revive that approach and that orientation. It's not just the movement that was initiated by Sheikh Muhammad Abdul Wahhab from the Saudis, or the Saudi camp, or Najd, we should say, because the House of Saud, it was the political branch of the reality of what we call today the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was the religious side. I don't like to use that terminology, but they had based themselves on the idea of Ibn Taymiyyah, that you had the rulers and the scholars working together. And that's how they established it. And so they have something that's called Ali Sheikh, the family of the Sheikh Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. He wasn't the only one. That's erroneous to think that that was the case. You had a good many other scholars that they started to want to revive a more textual based, less philosophical oriented approach to Aqidah. And you had those that were already moving in that direction way before, whether it was a Suyuti, or before him, whether it was Ibn Salah, and Nawawi, Ibn Hajar. You had a number of people, even if they associated with the Ash'ari orientation, they didn't follow the trajectory of the scholars of Kalam within the Ash'ari school. The later day Ash'ari school, according to Dr. Muhammad, Muhammad Salih Muhammad Said, who was a professor of Islamic philosophy in the School of Literature at the University of Minya, which is in Egypt. Amazing scholar. He talks. He's by no means an anti-ilm al-kalam person. He was a professor of philosophy. But he talks about how the later day Ash'aris, they fell into a trajectory of very philosophized Aqidah research, and they actually introduced more and more into the Ash'ari school the philosophical tendency, and you began to see it in people like Fakhr al-Razi and others, rahmatullahi alayh, and even the terminology became more and more philosophical. So the Ash'ari school is not one orientation, people. And as a matter of fact, most of the books of Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari we don't have with us. And the ones that we do, there's what we call يعني في معركة فكرية حولها. There's an intellectual battle that surrounds these books with regard to authenticating the book and saying that it belongs to Imam al-Ash'ari, Abu al-Hasan, or saying it does belong to it does belong to him, but we don't agree with some of the contents. Those battles go back and forth between, in today's time, who we would call the Salafi camp and some of the contemporary Ash'ari scholars in Ilm al-Kalam. In that event, going back to the point, it's known that the Ash'ari school began to develop different trajectories. It's not one trajectory, not one school. Just like even in the Maliki madhab, in fiqh, it's not one school. You have the school of Iraq, you have the school of Medina, you have the school of Egypt, you have the Moroccan school. You have different tendencies, and they write different, and they approach things in a different way. And that's the same thing within the Ash'ari school of Aqidah. Not all of the Ash'aris are of the same ilk or same orientation, although they agree on some things, some fundamentals. And one of the contemporary scholars of Ilm al-Kalam, who's an amazing scholar, his name is Dr. Hamza Bakri. He's right now teaching in Turkey. And from my understanding, he's from the scholars of Jordan. And recently, within the past few weeks, it's been more than 3 weeks actually, within the past, I would say a few months, he did a talk on the hadith tendency among the Ash'aris. And he acknowledges that reality, that also within the Ash'ari school, there's this tendency of hadith. And so all of the Ash'ari school doesn't move towards an approach of ilm al-kalam that's heavily philosophically based. Sheikh Uthman then Fodio, rahmatullahi alayhi, as I mentioned before in other talks, he also acknowledges the difference in methodology, or the differences in methodology that can be taken on in Aqidah studies. And what he does is he centralizes the Quran. So this brings us full circle. The idea of ilahiyat, or the idea of talking about who is Allah in a very general way, because as Muslims we don't believe in talking about the essence of Allah. No one can reach that, subhanahu wa ta'ala. But there's qualities. We talk about Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala with regard to names and attributes and so on and so forth. And sorry for the background noise with the wind, but it's a nice environment to be in. The ilahiyat concept, people, one of the first things that Sheikh Uthman Fodi brings up, which is important to understand, is the non-eternity of the world. The ilahiyat concept, it really is an approach, a methodology that you have to understand in general as a framework. The idea of the Ash'aris, especially the later day Ash'aris, and sometimes they don't bring it out clearly, the idea that they have is that we have to understand existence, the natural world. And when we can understand the natural world clearly, we can understand that the natural world, including ourselves, that we're dependent on the Creator. And so for the Ash'ari approach, at least what we find, that becomes dominant within the Ash'ari school, but it's by no means a new reality, because even when you go back to Imams like Al-Baqalani, who Imam Ibn Taymiyyah rahmatullahi alayhi praised as being one of the greatest of Ash'aris, in his book At-Tamheed, which is published, it was published in Iraq, it's 2 volumes, the publishing, the version that I've seen, alhamdulillah that we had access to that. He talks about this point of the non-eternity of the world. So this was an early problem that was there in the past because of the infiltration of philosophy. The Greeks, they believed in the eternity of the world to a certain extent. That was there heavy in philosophy. So the Mu'tazila that came before the Ash'aris, and the Ash'aris, Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari was part of them and is debating with them. That doesn't mean that the Mu'tazila represented the position of Quran and Sunnah. They didn't represent in everything the position of Quran and the Sunnah. The Mu'tazila were a group of people that delved into philosophy, and they took on the way of philosophy, and they laid out the framework for what eventually would be a framework adopted by many Asharis. That's a reality. The Asharis, what they did is they refined it and they used it to prove points in the Quran and the Sunnah that were overlooked by the Mu'tazila or reinterpreted by the Mu'tazila. But the Mu'tazila were engaged with the philosophers. And some of the Muslims had delved into that movement as well, heavily. The Mu'tazila were engaged with the philosophers, but as a group that wasn't totally submitted to the philosophers, but they produced heavy scholarship, like a Zamakhshari. Imam Zamakhshari is an amazing Imam in tafsir in the Arabic language. All of his positions are not agreed with, but there's not many who can deny his scholarship. He was high level. So the Mu'tazila themselves had impacted. And so when they impacted, it became a point in Aqidah very necessary to rationally prove the existence of Allah, meant that you had to prove the non-eternity of the world. And that became the focus of Ilahiyat, or the study of who Allah is in a very general sense. What are the qualities of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, and what are the qualities of the created order? So the methodology of the Ash'ari in general is to deal with this question, and then from there you begin to develop another level to that framework, another level to that framework. The other level to that framework is you begin to talk about nubuwat, or prophethood. This is not the approach that you find, for instance, in an Ibn Taymiyyah or someone like him. Ibn Taymiyyah comes after the fact. He represents a philosophical trajectory amongst Ahl al-Hadith. And he represents the muhaddith amongst the scholars of Kalam. So he has positions that they don't always agree with, no doubt. He becomes a controversial figure. But that's neither here nor there, because Imam al-Ghazali took positions that people didn't agree with. Fakhruddin al-Razi took positions that people didn't agree with. It's just that the trajectory that Ibn Taymiyyah continued on was not the trajectory that the general body of later day Ash'aris were on. But even there's differences among the early generation of Ash'aris and the later day school on certain points and certain issues. These are academic issues in which there's detailed points that in order to understand, you have to go deep. But the point here is saying that for the Ash'ari, what's important is the non-eternity of the world. Necessary. That's why for them, it was a position which they emphasized so much that some of the scholars had to pause some of their imams, because they would say that in order for your Aqidah to be correct, you have to have, with clear certainty, worked out the idea mentally, philosophically, rationally, that the world is not eternal. And then from there you build your idea that God exists, because everything in the world is not eternal, and it exists, but that means it should be dependent upon something to exist. And from there the idea of God comes, and then from there God is the one that maintains the whole of the creation. And then from there the idea that God, part of maintaining a part of the creation, which is the human being, is the sending of the rusul, or the messengers. And even in that, people, like, sometimes when you look at the books, there's some points that are not 100%. They lack a little bit of refinement, because the rusul, the messengers, consist of both angels and human beings. And so sometimes they bring in this idea of they bring in this idea of the rusul, and they keep focusing on the human side, and then they focus that it's only men can be rusul, and then they forget that the ayah of the Quran, the ayah of the Quran clearly says that amongst the rusul are malaika. So here the ayah says, Allahu yastafi min al malaika, that Allah chooses from the malaika rusulan wa min al nasi, right? Inna Allah sami'un basir, that Allah chooses from the malaika and from human beings. Allah chooses from the malaika, literally rusul, and from human beings, right? And so that's ayat 75 in Surah Al-Hajj. So that has to be clarified a little bit, because sometimes in the writings, it's just an educational point that they try to simplify. But we have to be clear that Allah not only sends Rasul to us from human beings, but sends to those that He chose to be Rasul, right? The difference is that the Rasul, like Sheikh Abdurrahman Mahmoud, or Dr. Abdurrahman Mahmoud, he says that the Malaika come to teach a point. The Malaika come to teach a point. And they can come to teach the mother of Musa, they can come to teach the Prophet Muhammad, or they can come to teach Maryam alayhi salam. So in that point, revelation comes to men and women, because Imam Ibn Hazm had the argument that women can be prophets, which is not a mainstream idea, because you have some ayat of the Quran which say, which talk about the reality of men, being the prophets or the messengers, right? وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا مِنْ قَبْلِكَ إِلَّا رِجَالًا نُوحَى إِلَيْهِمْ. And that's the fourth ayah of Surah An-Nahl. I'm sorry, not the fourth ayah. It's the 43rd ayah of Surah An-Nahl. That we have not sent the messengers before you except males that we give revelation to. So the important piece is that, and the only one that I've seen so far in my brief studies that kind of clarifies that point, because Sheikh Abdurrahman, Mahmoud Abdurrahman is a scholar in Usul al-Fiqh. So he mentions that point clearly. He says the Rusul to us are commissioned to clarify and communicate the message for us. Whereas the angels that are Rusul, are messengers, they're sent with specific tasks, like to clarify a point or to communicate knowledge. But the issue of al-bu'tha or al-bu'tha is to be commissioned, right? So the Rusul are commissioned, and then they become an authority over us, a proof over us that Allah gave us knowledge of which we're responsible to live up to. That's an important piece. So in order to get to that point of talking about the Rusul, the Asharis, they build a rational system of talking about the existence of God and how God is unlike the creation, and how God is unlike the creation. So what Sheikh Uthman then Fodio does is, when he talks about the ilahiyat, he's talking about the qualities of Allah. He doesn't talk about all of the qualities of Allah. He's talking about some principal qualities of Allah and how they are foundational in the Quran. How they're foundational in the Quran. So there he deviates a little bit. And he even says that, look, the non-eternity of the world is spelled out in the Quran. So that brings us to another point of Iman, which is the issue of belief in the books, belief in the message itself. The difference here, what we find is that a person like Ibn Taymiyyah will say that we have to rationally prove the necessity of the messengers. And once we rationally prove the necessity of the messengers and we believe in them, then we believe in the books that they brought, right? We believe in the message that they have to communicate. And then that message tells us about who God is. That doesn't mean that there's no usage of the intellect. But both camps, to be honest with you, Ahl al-Hadith and their variations and approaches from the scholars of Ilm al-Kalam, and I mentioned this before, Sheikh Uthman Fodi mentions this as well, they neglect a focus on the creation. It starts off that way, but the universe, the universe itself is supposed to be discussed in the research area or under the topic of al-alam, like Rabbul Alameen, right? So al-alam is everything that's created, seen and unseen. Everything that's created, seen and the universe is part of that which is manifest. And then there's, deeper unseen reality. So then that brings us to the third area of research in Ilm al-Kalam, which is Samiyat. Samiyat is based on the idea of Sama', is what we hear. So there's certain knowledge that's communicated to us and we hear it, or is communicated to us so that we listen to it. We can't achieve it by reflection, by thinking about it. We can't achieve it by observation. One of the things that the ulama of Kalam, and including Ibn Taymiyyah in Usul al-Tafsir, and the principles of Tafsir, he brings up the idea, what are the sources of knowledge? The scholars of Ilm al-Kalam, they have that discussion. Imam al-Sanusi, he has that discussion. Imam al-Nasafi has that discussion. Many of the scholars have that discussion, right? So the senses are a source of knowledge. Reflection is a source of knowledge. And Khabar al-Sadiq, the report that comes from a truthful messenger or person that communicates truthfully, that's a source of knowledge. So the knowledge of revelation falls into that category. The knowledge of revelation falls into the category of knowledge which is transmitted to us by a truthful messenger. So Sheikh Uthman Fodi, he says that these foundational points of Aqidah, we find them in the Quran. We don't have to resort to reflective reasoning. We don't have to resort to a systematic reasoning, but they're also reinforced by the universe. So Sheikh Uthman Fodi, that's one of the points which we can say that he's reviving knowledge that fell into neglect somewhat, which is centrality of the Quran to give us knowledge of Aqidah versus overly depending on reason, even if it is that we support it with Quran and Sunnah, or overly depending on Hadith, because sometimes some of the scholars, you find some of the scholars Hadith will overly depend on Hadith, and the centrality of the Quran kind of goes to the side, right? And so those 2 points or those 2 sources of knowledge, the Quran and the creation itself, Sheikh Uthman Fodi lifts those up and reminds us both come from Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. So when we talk about on page 10 of the PDF itself, when we talk about Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala has established that his existence is before time, Huwa al-Awwal, right? Here it says al-Qadim, and I mentioned that that's a name that's given to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, or an attribute that's given to Allah in Ilm al-Kalam, because it fits within that philosophical system. But Shaykh Uthman Fodi takes the Quranic terminology that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is the first, and before him is nothing. You know what I'm saying? There's no thing. That's what we mean by nothing. There's no thing. He is the first, and that's it. And there's nothing that comes after, right? And that's when we talk about the term al-Baqi. And the ayat of the Quran is and rely upon the living who will never die, meaning that everything in the creation is depending on Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, right? And then the other principle comes in that everything has an origin, right? Before we go into this other principle, everything has its origin in that is created. Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala is uncreated. Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala is living. Everything comes to expiration except Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. So then now the principle comes in that Allah is unlike anything in the creation, right? There laysa kamithlihi shay. That's an important principle in Aqidah. It's an important principle in Aqidah. And then huwa al-ghani, right? And that is that Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala is independent in the real sense. So that means that all of the creation is dependent on Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, right? All of the creation is dependent upon Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. So at the core, nothing is like Allah. So you can't compare anything to Allah. So that means that the created order, the alim, so to speak, is a reflection. It reflects truths about Allah. The names and attributes of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala are not limited to the 99 names as we know. The names and attributes of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, are numerous. But what we stick with is that which is established in the Quran and the Sunnah, right? But that doesn't mean that all of the knowledge of who Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala is contained in just the 99 names. But the creation itself teaches us about who Allah is. And the creation is understood by way of the Quran. And so here it says that Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala is one. Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala is one, right? In essence and attributes and actions, right? And that's what we get in the term ahad. In the ayah, Qul huwallahu ahad, right? And that Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala has power over all things and has put a determining point and an identity on all things. Verily, Allah has power over all things. Wa ala kulli shayin qadir. Right? And so then we're taught that Allah has a will. And there's an important thing here with the idea that Allah has a will. It's a very important point here. And that is the will of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala is known in revelation. And the will of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala also manifests itself in the universe. So everything moves according to the will of Allah, but not every human action, pay attention to that point, is pleasing to Allah. Everything in the world that's seen and unseen moves according to the will of Allah. But when it comes to human beings, not all of our actions are pleasing to Allah. The only way that we gain the pleasure of Allah is by following the will of Allah as taught to us in the Quran and in the Sunnah. Taught to us in the Quran and in the Sunnah. Right? So that clarifies for us how it is that our will conforms with the will of Allah when it comes to moral decisions. But we don't tell our bodies what to do. We don't tell our bodies to age or to grow. All of that is according to the will of Allah, independent of our will. We don't stop death. We don't control our birth. Human beings have a very rare position in the universe. Very rare position. And that's another discussion. And Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala is all-knowing. al-alim, right? And so these things are laid, the foundation is laid down for them in the Quran. One of the things that I wish that Sheikh Muhammad Sharif would have done when he translated this is focus on the ayat of the Quran in a systematic way. He focused more on bringing some points of his practice of Sufism in, and it somewhat takes away from understanding the points of Aqidah that are being brought to the forth by Sheikh Uthman and Fodio. So these things require like an independent study, overall. Not only is Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala all-knowing, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is living already. It was mentioned before, right? The living. And Allah is all-hearing, and Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala has insight, deep insight. It's not just a general knowledge, but it's a detailed expert knowledge. And those ayat of Quran, or that ayat of the Quran, in reality, it teaches us how sometimes in philosophy, some of the scholars that were following the philosophers, they made a mistake, mostly in the Mu'tazila approach, because they claim that Allah doesn't have knowledge of particulars. I don't want to go into too much depth, but here the ayah of the Quran is clearly saying, Huwa al-Basir, right? And the idea of who Allah is as al-Basir means that Allah has detailed knowledge of things, not just a general knowledge of things, but detailed knowledge. And Allah speaks in the Quran, we know is part of the speech of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. But remember the ayah of the Quran that says Allah is independent. Allah is unlike all of the creation. The creation is dependent, right? And that's something to keep in mind when we think about these realities. And Allah is free. That's another point. That your Lord creates what He wills, and He alone chooses. That ayah of the Quran also is another point of heavy debate with the Mu'tazila. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, especially within the Ash'ari school, is heavily emphasized this point that Allah moves as Allah wills. Sometimes the Ash'aris go to an extreme on that, because they claim that Allah is just, but then they say, if Allah wanted, Allah can put a servant into hell, whether He will, whether the person deserves or doesn't deserve. And so those are qualities that getting into that type of debate, we know that Allah is just. So there's no necessity to go deep philosophically onto that issue. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, why Allah sent the Rusul? Why would He send the Rusul if He just wants to punish a human being? So just for the sake of punishing a human being because He wills. So the reality of the situation is what happens sometimes in these debates between these different groups is that some of the Quranic meanings are lost in the name of them arguing with each other and taking a position. And so that's why the centrality of the Quran becomes important. And you see that especially in the debates over free will and whether the human being is determined or whether the human being has free will. The Quran establishes the human being has free will. The Quran establishes that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala has dominion over all things. It's a special marriage between those two realities. And the Prophet ﷺ taught us not to go deep into that, the nations that came before us, they were confused. But in today's time, science even shows that everything is not just cause and effect, that there's something there of freedom, especially when we talk about the human being. And then we come into the issue now of a nubuwat, or prophethood. And we preempted ourselves in that regard. And we mentioned some points of prophethood already. One of the things that comes up in ilm al-kalam, and not only in the ilm al-kalam, this issue comes up also in the study of Aqidah from the Athari methodology is, do we consider the Rusul and the Anbiya as one and the same thing, or are there some slight differences? And the ulama took positions on that. The ulama, they took positions on that. There's one school of thought that says that they're synonymous, right? But there's a slight distinction. A group of scholars have gone with the position that the two words are synonymous and mean the same thing, and thus every prophet is called a messenger, and every messenger is called the prophet, right? But the majority of the scholars, they show the distinction. The majority of the scholars, they have said that one is a subset of the other. That's where they bring in the distinction. A prophet is whoever has received something from Allah through revelation, regardless of whether he has been commanded to convey it to others or not, right? But if he's commanded to convey it to others, then he's a messenger as well. He's a messenger as well. Those are technical issues, people. Technical issues. And then it says, this is because the matter is simple, as long as the discussion, as we have said, is not connected to any other decisive and necessary issues of the deen. Rather, it's a branch issue or detailed issue that involves personal reasoning among the ulama with more than one understanding of the issue. That's the position of Dr. Ramadan al-Bouti. He says that issue. He tries to show that there's a distinction. But when we talk about the Rusul, it becomes important to understand this issue, because we mentioned that the Rusul could be angels. And then we mentioned that in many books of Aqidah, immediately they talk about the messengership of human beings, and they forget to really clarify the point of the angels. The other issue is that immediately once you talk about the messengers being human beings, you get into the issue of men being the messengers, right? And so I clarified that point, and I said that Sheikh Dr. Mahmoud Abdurrahman, he brought up the point of what? He brought up the point that the Rasul from amongst the angels, they come to educate on a certain point. But when we talk about the fact that they may come to women like the mother of Musa or Maryam, alayhi salam, then they're coming to teach a certain point, which is communicated, right? But they're not obligated to be in leadership over the people. Whereas the Rusul, from among the men, 25 are mentioned in the Quran, they're obligated. Those 25, we have to believe in them. The hadith that puts the Anbiya or the prophets at this point at about 124,000, that hadith is da'if. It has some issues to it. We can substantiate about 310 in that range, roughly. But the reality of the situation is that we have a principle in Islam, which is a very important principle, and that is that every nation has received a messenger. So that removes the idea of exclusiveness when it comes to revelation. We see that the followers of Musa, they try to make an exclusive claim to prophecy. No, the idea of the chosen people, and by default, the idea that prophethood is only restricted within that community, it's not a concept that we as Muslims believe. We believe in the universality of prophethood, but we believe that the prophets went to their people. The only universal prophet is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that we know of. That's clear to us with evidence. There may have been at some time, but the prophets that we know of, they were sent to their people. Right? So that's an important point. That the idea that the Rasul went to all of humanity. One second, please. So there's another issue that comes in that needs to be brought up, but I want to pause it here. And those are the qualities of the prophets as it was understood by the scholars of Kalam. So the one is the idea of protection, right? The idea of protection here means al-isma usually is translated as infallible, but we don't want to use that term infallible. That's the first quality, and we'll talk about that because that's a big issue that comes up. The second is the obligation of communicating the message. The third is what we call al-fatana, or insight and knowledge. And the fifth is the principle we've already mentioned it, malehood. And the fifth is freedom from deficiencies. Those things, those five qualities require discussions in and of themselves. That's why we want to pause that discussion. But the prophet, the idea of prophethood is established in the Quran. The knowledge of prophethood is established in the Quran because the Quran conveys to us the stories of the prophets. It also conveys to us the mu'jizat, the idea that the prophets had what we would call miracles, and the truthfulness of the prophets. Now, the idea of mu'jizat, people, is extremely important in the Ashari methodology. The idea of mu'jizat is extremely important in the Ashari methodology, or the scholars of ilm al-kalam, is tied into their system of how it is that they deal with prophethood. So we'll talk a little bit about those issues and also some of the differences of approach between the people of hadith and the scholars of kalam in this regard. But when we talk about the foundation for nubuwat being in the Quran, those are some of the key pieces. The stories of the prophets, the idea of mu'jizat, right, the miracles of the prophets, and the idea of the truthfulness of the prophets, especially the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We see that this is something that the Quran is affirming, right, with regularity before the doubts and the negation of the truthfulness of the prophet that is coming from Quraysh, right? The doubts coming from Quraysh about who the prophet is and the negation of his truthfulness. So the Quran establishes a foundation for nubuwat. The scholars of ilm al-kalam, they use those five qualities that I mentioned to talk about nubuwat from, kind of rational perspective, a philosophical perspective. And it has its issues. It has its issues, especially when we start talking about the protection of the prophets from sin, al-isma, or infallibility, because sometimes the theory that they bring forth is not so tight. And even Dr. Hamza Bakri, in his explanation of al-Nasafiyya, he brings this as, I think it's al-Nasafiyya or al-Umda, one of those two books. I believe it's in Nasafiyya. And his explanation of al-Nasafiyya, Aqid al-Nasafiyya, and he brings up this problem that there's there's a range of positions that they take on the issue, and they agree on some fine points, right? And last time I read some from Umar Ashkar, which in general solves the problem, in this regard. On the issue of what we translate as infallibility, but it's better said the protection of Allah over the prophets, alayhimus salam. Umar al-Ashqar wrote a book, Message and Messengers, in which he talks about this reality. It's at the level of the university level study. It's translated into English, and it has some points that are philosophically argued. He tries to take a more of a balanced hadith-based approach. But what I mentioned is brought up. What I mentioned as the 5 qualities of the prophets. These points are brought up in Ilm al-Kalam. Sheikh Uthman bin Fodio also has some discussion on it from the angle of Ilm al-Kalam as well in some of his other books. And so those issues are brought up. So it's important to understand the methodologies and approaches. As we mentioned in the Ash'ari methodology, proving the non-eternity of the world and the existence of Allah. After that comes the reality of the mu'jizat and nubuwat, of miracles and prophethood. But miracles and prophethood first have to be established on what foundation? The foundation of God's existence. That's not the approach of people like Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah rationally argues for prophets and for the truthfulness of the prophets and for the truthfulness of the message. Then from there, the clarity on who Allah is, because they were not dealing with the problem of he was not dealing with the problem of the existence of Allah 100%. You know what I'm saying? They had an understanding that people believe in Allah's existence. But in today's time, what we call ilhad or atheism, ilhad in the past didn't have the same meanings as it has today. So even the pagan nations and others, even the Greeks, they believe in some form of deities. In today's time, the whole issue of raw materialism wasn't a reality back then. The whole issue of raw materialism today, where there's no God that exists, period. That wasn't the case in the past for the most part. There's said to be some exceptions in Ethiopia. There was supposedly a wise man, Dr. Lewis Gordon. He argues that this man was an atheist. But for the most part, you don't find the materialist, secular approach in the same way. You may find people that have a weak belief in deities, but it's not to the extent of like a Dawkins or something like that. So in any event, the need to prove God's existence was done in a little bit of a different way in the past. It was more to prove that things are not God. But in today's time, the idea becomes, how do we know that God exists foundationally, right? People have a crisis of meaning. And that brings us to the whole question of what is the task of Ilm al-Kalam in Aqidah studies? Because these things can totally be handled only by just reference to Quran and the Sunnah solely. The Quran and the Sunnah serve as a foundation, but also you need some rational positions. You need some justifications for belief. So the role of Ilm al-Kalam, is it to have the Salafis and the Ash'aris argue with one another? That was never the role of Kalam from the beginning. The role of Kalam was to clarify points of doubt in Aqidah, especially when it came from those who didn't believe in Islam, or those that were new to Islam. And so in today's time, the role of Aqidah, more specifically some sort of Ilm al-Kalam, would be to address those types of issues. Within the circle of Islam, the Muslims have their tools, whether it's the Arabic language or usul al-fiqh, principles of tafsir, hadith, to discuss the differences that they have among each other in a principled, systematic, and civil way. But when it comes to rationally arguing about points of Aqidah to non-Muslims, or dealing with problems of philosophy and science, you may use some of those tools, but they don't believe in the centrality of the Quran. For us, we believe in the authenticity and centrality of the Quran. So the Quran becomes a primary source for the knowledge of Aqidah overall and trumps other sources. Everything else is there to assist us in understanding what the Quran is saying, whether it's hadith or intellect, right? But when you start dealing with non-Muslims, now your sources change a little bit. Now you have to be able to explain to someone that doesn't believe in the centrality of the Quran points in Aqidah. So that requires an understanding of the principles of research in Aqidah studies and some of the techniques that are being used by the scholars of Kalam, whether they're from the scholars of Hadith or the scholars that are relying on a more philosophical approach. But that's a different set of discussions that needs to take place. And that really is for the students of knowledge, right? The average person that's not going to go deep into that may get confused on that type of thing, because this is not a discussion that comes out in the open. That's just the reality at the end of the day. But this is a discussion which takes place among those who are researchers in this area of knowledge, right? What methodology do we use? When and where? You know, it's the question. So with that, people, we come to an end, and we'll return back to Nubuwat, and we will continue, inshallah. لو في العمر بقية, as the ulama say, if there's life for us, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Astaghfirullah wa atubu ilayh.